Okay, so like I said, now we're going to be looking at all these changes. Like we've talked about A being a vertical stretch or shrink. We've talked about how B is going to change the period. Basically, it's going to be a horizontal stretch or shrink. H, we said, is going to move it. If it's a minus H, it's going to move it to the right. And if we have a plus K, that's going to move us up or down. Our book uses H and K here. A lot of textbooks I have seen do it like this. They call those C and D. So just be aware that, you can call these HK or CD or whatever variables you want. All right, so our step-by-step method for graphing. Here's the first thing we're going to do. If we are given y equals a sine of x plus c, whoops, put a b in front of that parenthesis, a sine b, parentheses x plus c plus d. So the first thing we're going to look at is what our starting point is. Our starting value for x is going to be equal to negative c. Do you see what I mean? So if this is x plus pi, where would we start? At negative pi, right? So that's going to be our starting value for x. The next thing we're going to do is find the period. The period is always going to be 2 pi over b. So first we're going to look at c, then we're going to look at b, and then we're going to use that period because we know the change in our x is going to be equal to 1/4 of the period. Remember how we talked about that? So these two things, step 2 and 3, are things we've already done. It's just we have not done a shift left or right yet, so that'll be new. And so then after that, we're going to add delta x to the x values until we have 5 points. So these are the 4 ways, the 4 things we have to do to come up with the x part of our graph. Okay, now to come up with the y part of our graph, here's what we have to do. So we have to see if we have sine. If we have sine, what are the 5 key points for sine? Can somebody tell me what they were? Around that unit circle, Maya? Okay, so if we have sine, we're going to put those down for y. If we have cosine, what are we going to write down? Abby? Good. So these are going to be our y values for sine. These are going to be our y values for cosine. We've already done that. 6th thing we have to do. Well, we have to look at this vertical stretch or shrink. So we have to take those y values, multiply these, all those values, by a, whatever a is, because that's going to be our vertical stretch or shrink. And then the last thing we would have to do is take care of this d value. Our book calls it a k value. And so what would we do to all of these y's at that point? We'd have to do what? Yeah, add k or d, whichever one you want to call it. We called that d, so let's just say add d or subtract d. Okay? So let's start with kind of an easy one. Let's just come over here to the side. Got a little room right here. Let's do y equals 3 cosine x minus 2. And we're trying to come up with those 5 key points so that we can graph. So the first thing we have to do is find out our starting value. Do we have anything in parentheses with the x? No. So where are we going to start, Tyler? 0. I go to my second step. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by b. B is whatever's in front of x. It's just 1. So what's our period going to be then, Dominic? 2 pi. Step 3, take a fourth of 2 pi. That gives me pi over 2. So Charlie Hall, can you tell me what these would be if I have to keep adding on pi over 2? Think of a half plus a half. Yep. Good. So now I'm down to step 4. We just did that. We just did step 4. Down to step 5. Look and see whether we have sine or cosine. So we have cosine. All right. So what are we going to put then, Natalia? What are our values for cosine? Don't go so fast. Do just the basic values for cosine.
1, 0, -1, 0, 1.
Good. We go down to our 6th step, and she was going to go ahead and do that for us. So Natalia, now continue. What are they now going to be?
3, 0, -3, 0, 3.
Good. And then we should understand that the reason we multiply first is because of order of operations. Wouldn't you always multiply before you add or subtract? Yeah. So now the last thing we do is subtract 2, and I'll just do that real quickly. -2, -2, -2, -2, and -2. That's a positive 1. Okay? And so those would be our 5 key points we can now graph. Easy enough, right? All right, so let's get a little bit more challenging. Go over to the last 2 examples that we've got, number 5. Okay, so looking at number 5. So the first thing we have to look at is, do we have a shift left or right? Sydney, do we?
Yes.
Where is it going to start? Pi, good. The second thing I have to look at is the period. So for the period, I'm going to have to do 2 pi divided by 1/2. Michaela, what is that? 4 pi, good. 2 pi divided by 1/2 is 2 pi times 2, so the period is going to be 4 pi. So now I have to take a fourth of that. And Alicia, what's a fourth of 4 pi? And so can you keep adding on pi's here? Good. Okay, now I have to look at which I'm using, sine or cosine. I'm using sine. Okay, and so Charlie Hall, can you tell me all the values for sine?
0,
No.
1.
Thank you. Keep going.
0.
Good. And now we would have to multiply them all by 1. That doesn't matter. We add 1, 1, 2, 1, 0, 1. Okay? Easy? Makes sense, right? Okay, let's go over to number 6 now, and let's make this a little more challenging because I think it's a little too easy the way it is. Let's at least throw in like a -4 out in front. Just put in a -4 out in front. Okay, now we'll go with that. Okay, so where are we going to start? Drew, where am I going to start? Okay, but I want to know what's the shift left or right actually is where I start.
It starts at -pi.
Good. Okay, now go ahead and tell me what the period would be.
It would be 2 pi over 1, 2 pi.
Right, and tell me what the change is in the period.
It would be 0, pi over 4, pi over 2.
Hold on a minute. I'm talking about what's the change in the period. So you just have to do 2 pi divided by 4. What's 2 pi divided by 4?
It's 1 pi.
Okay, so pi over 2. So that's what you should be adding on. Okay, so now go. What is it?
-pi over 2, 0. Pi over 2, pi. 3 pi over 2.
Good. All right, and so now we want to know the values for cosine. Scotty, can you look back at your notes and tell me what the values are for cosine?
1, 0, -1, 0, 1.
Good. Okay, and now we have to think about what we do next. Becky, can you tell me what we would do next? Okay. And Caroline, what do I do last? Subtract 3. Okay. So let's say we're taking a test. We want to get this right, so we're going to check it. I'm not sure I'm going to let you use calculators since I've shown you so much on it, but we'll see. So I'm going to put this in here. So now I need to set up my table. So my table is starting at -pi/2. And my table is going by pi/2. Oh, thank you. I see that now. So -pi divided by 2. Okay, and then I'm going up by pi/2. And so now when I look at my table, I should see those key points. And if I did not, then I would know that I made a mistake. Okay? All right. A couple more things here. Just fill this in wherever you can. So what if I gave you the function y equals 6 cosine of 2x, and I asked you to shift it down 1, reflect over y equals -1, and shift right pi/2. So we have a function y equals 6 cosine of 2x. I want you to shift it down 1, reflect it over the line y equals -1, and shift it right pi/2. I'll be thinking about that. What would that be? So we'll call this, let me call this f instead of y. So this is f. G is going to be what happens after we do all of that. Any ideas? If I want to shift it down 1, where do I put the Charlie? Yep, so I need to subtract 1 at the end. Good. To reflect it over, have you noticed how if we have a negative in front, it reflects it over? So all that means is if I want a reflection over this new midline, all I have to do is put a negative here. Okay? So far I've got this, -6 cosine. I don't want to change the period. If I want it to shift to the right pi/2, what am I going to replace the x with? X minus pi/2, and then -1. And that would be it. Okay? All right, guys, so you have your assignment up there on the assignment sheet as well as on the board.